I woke up with the worst headache of my life. My mouth was dry, my temples throbbed, and my stomach churned with a familiar nausea that told me I had drunk way too much the night before. I groaned, rolling over, expecting to feel the warmth of my husband beside me. But the sheets were cold. That wasn't unusual. Jacob often got up early. He was one of those men who actually liked mornings, always up before sunrise, sipping his black coffee on the porch, watching the world wake up while I buried myself under the covers. But something felt off. I forced myself to sit up, blinking against the daylight filtering through the blinds. The room was eerily quiet. No smell of coffee. No sound of running water from the bathroom. Just silence. And then, like a punch to the gut, the memories from last night slammed into me. The fight. The drinking. The words I had said. I'm just waiting for you to die so I can be free. Oh God. I clutched my head, squeezing my eyes shut. Had I really said that? The words echoed, dripping with venom. The slur of my drunken voice making them even crueler. I tried to tell myself I hadn't meant it, that it was just the alcohol talking, but I knew that was a lie. Deep down, in the places I didn't let myself think about when I was sober, there was a truth to those words. Jacob had never been a bad husband. That was the worst part. He was stable, kind in his quiet way, reliable to a fault. The kind of man who worked hard, paid bills on time, and never raised his voice. He didn't cheat. He didn't lie. He didn't even have any real vices, aside from the occasional cigar on the back porch. And yet I hated him for it. Not in an aggressive way. Not in a way that made me want to hurt him. But in a slow, suffocating way. Jacob was predictable. Boring. And I had spent 10 years trapped in a marriage that felt like a life sentence. I used to tell myself I loved him. Probably did, once. But love fades when every day is exactly like the one before it. When you know exactly how every conversation will go before it even happens. When the thought of spending the next 30 years with someone makes you feel like you're drowning. I had found my escape in secret places. Wine bottles, long drives, and eventually in someone else's arms. I bit my lip, my heart pounding as I turned to the nightstand where my phone sat, face down. With shaky fingers, I picked it up and unlocked the screen. No texts. No missed calls. A flicker of unease twisted in my gut. Jacob never left without saying something. Even if he was pissed at me, even if I had gone too far, he always left a note. I stood up, wincing at the pounding in my skull as I grabbed my robe and padded down the hall. The house was too quiet. No sound of the TV. No dishes in the sink from his usual morning routine. I reached the kitchen. Empty. His car keys weren't on the hook. His work boots were gone. I swallowed hard, moving faster now, yanking open the closet. His favorite leather jacket? Gone. His duffel bag? Not on the shelf where it always sat. A cold sweat broke over me as I turned in circles, scanning the room for anything that indicated he was coming back. There was nothing. No note. No goodbye. Just gone. Panic wrapped around my throat. Jacob wasn't the kind of man to storm out after an argument. He was steady. He stayed no matter how bad things got. No matter how cruel I was to him. I ran back to the bedroom, grabbing my phone, my fingers trembling as I called him. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I opened our banking app. My stomach dropped. A withdrawal of $3,000. Jacob wasn't just mad. He wasn't cooling off at some motel. He had planned this. Somehow between last night and this morning my husband had made a decision. And he had disappeared. For the first time in our marriage, I was the one left behind. I sat on the edge of the bed. My pulse hammering in my ears, staring at the empty space where Jacob's duffel bag used to be. My hand shook as I dialed his number again, pressing the phone so hard against my ear that it hurt. Voicemail. Again. I tried to tell myself that he was just trying to scare me, that he'd be back once he calmed down. But the empty closet, the missing car keys, and the bank withdrawal told a different story. This wasn't a tantrum. This was calculated. My husband, the man who never made impulsive decisions, who never left anything unfinished, had walked away from our life without a second thought. And I had driven him to it. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the words replaying in my head. The drunken confession I had let slip past my lips. I'm just waiting for you to die so I can be free. What the hell had I been thinking? Jacob wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve that. Not after everything he had done for me. I had wanted to hurt him, to shake him out of that quiet, predictable existence of his, to make him feel the resentment that had been eating me alive for years. I never thought he'd actually leave. My throat was dry as I scrolled through my messages, searching for something, anything that might tell me where he went. But there was nothing. The last text from him was from yesterday afternoon. See you tonight. And that was it. I checked his social media, no updates. I checked his location, disabled. My stomach turned. He had shut me out completely. I stood up too fast, the hangover making my head spin as I staggered toward the bathroom, gripping the sink for support. I stared at my reflection, at the dark circles under my eyes, the smudged mascara I hadn't bothered to wash off the night before. My robe was loose, one side slipping down my shoulder, revealing bruises. Not from Jacob, never from Jacob, but from someone else. Someone who had made me feel alive in a way my husband never could. A sharp knock at the door made me jump, and for a split second hope bloomed in my chest. Maybe he had come back. Maybe he had just needed a few hours to clear his head. I rushed to the front door, pulling it open without thinking. And then my stomach dropped. It wasn't Jacob. It was him. The man I had told myself was just a distraction. The one I swore didn't mean anything. And yet there he was standing on my doorstep, looking at me with eyes that told me he had never believed that lie. Did he leave? He asked, his voice low, knowing. My mouth opened but nothing came out. Because I didn't have an answer. Because for the first time in my life, I had no idea what the hell I was supposed to do. I stood frozen in the doorway, my pulse hammering in my throat as I stared at him. Nate, the man I had sworn was just a mistake, just a reckless escape from a life I didn't want anymore. He looked at me like he already knew, like he had been expecting this, and that terrified me more than anything. Did he leave? His voice was calm, unreadable, but his eyes held something else, something sharp and waiting. My mouth felt dry. I wanted to lie, to tell him Jacob was just out for the morning, that this wasn't what it looked like. But I couldn't. The empty house, the silence that pressed in on me, the missing clothes and money. It was exactly what it looked like. Jacob was gone. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the door like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I don't know, I admitted, and I hated the way my voice shook. He didn't say anything. He just left. Nate's expression didn't change, but he took a step closer, filling the space between us with his presence, with the scent of his cologne, with the same intoxicating energy that had pulled me toward him in the first place. Are you surprised? The question hit me harder than it should have. I wanted to snap at him, to tell him that yes, of course I was surprised, that Jacob had always been the type to stay no matter what. But the truth was I had pushed him too far. I had spent years resenting him, years pretending, years searching for something that made me feel alive again. And last night I had finally said it out loud. I had given him a reason to leave. And he had taken it. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt standing there in my robe, the remnants of last night still clinging to me like a second skin. Why are you here? I asked, my voice quieter now. Nate tilted his head slightly, studying me like he was trying to decide how much truth I could handle. Because I knew this would happen. Because you made it clear you didn't want him. His voice lowered like he was saying something just for me. And because I wanted to see what you do now that you finally got what you wanted. My stomach twisted at his words. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I had never wanted Jacob to actually leave. But the worst part was I didn't know if that was true. I had wanted out. I had wanted freedom. And now that I had it, all I felt was an overwhelming sense of panic. I shook my head, stepping further back into the house, gripping the door like a lifeline. This was a mistake, I muttered, more to myself than to him. I need to fix this. Nate's lips curled slightly, something almost amused flickering across his face. Fix what, Shauna? His voice was slow, deliberate, like he was savoring each word. Jacob made his choice. You don't even know where he went. And let's be honest, you were never going to stay married to him forever. His words made something in my chest tighten, something that felt dangerously close to guilt. But before I could say anything, my phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down, my breath catching when I saw the name on the screen. Jacob. My fingers trembled as I swiped to answer, pressing the phone to my ear so fast it almost slipped from my grip. Jacob. Silence. My heart pounded. Jacob, where are you? Another pause. And then finally his voice. Low. Cold. Unfamiliar. Don't call me again. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my breath coming too fast, the weight of his words sinking into my bones. He wasn't coming back. He had meant it. And I had just lost the one thing I never thought I'd lose. The man who had always stayed. That I stood there, staring at my phone like I could will his name to appear again, like I could undo the last 10 seconds and make him say something else, anything else. But Jacob wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean. Don't call me again. I had spent years wishing he'd let go of me, and now that he had, all I felt was a twisting, gnawing emptiness that I didn't know what to do with. Nate was still there, watching me. I could feel his gaze like a weight pressing down on me, pulling me back into the moment, back into the reality I had created. His voice was quieter now, less amused. So that's it then. He's done. I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. I don't know, I whispered. But I did. I knew. Jacob wasn't coming back. And the worst part? He hadn't even yelled, hadn't cursed at me, hadn't begged for answers. He had just left. Like I had never mattered at all. I turned away from Nate, suddenly needing space, needing air. You should go. He didn't move. Shauna. I need to think. I cut him off, not looking at him. I need to figure out what I'm going to do. Nate exhaled, and for a second I thought he might argue, might try to convince me that this was a good thing, that Jacob leaving was what I had wanted all along. And maybe a few days ago I would have let him. Maybe I would have clung to him like a life raft, thrown myself into the idea that this was my new reality now. But everything felt wrong. The house felt wrong. It felt wrong. Finally I heard him step back. All right. Call me when you decide. I shut the door before he could say anything else. The silence of the house wrapped around me, suffocating and unfamiliar. I had never been alone in this house before. Not really. Even when Jacob worked late, I always knew he was coming home. That was the thing about him. He always came home. Until now. I moved through the house in a daze, running my fingers along the furniture, the walls, the pieces of my life that were still exactly where they had always been. The framed wedding photo still sat on the bookshelf. The coffee mug Jacob used every morning was still in the sink. His jacket was still draped over the chair by the door, like he had planned to grab it before he left but decided he didn't need it where he was going. I sank onto the couch, wrapping my arms around myself as the weight of it all pressed down on me. I should be relieved. I should be happy. I had wanted a way out, and Jacob had given me one. But all I could think about was the way he had sounded on the phone. Not angry. Not heartbroken. Just gone. I don't know how long I sat there before my phone buzzed again. I nearly dropped it in my rush to check the screen, my stomach twisting with hope before I even realized what I was hoping for. But it wasn't Jacob. It was a message from an unknown number. I thought you should know. He's not coming back. The breath left my lungs. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my mind racing. Who was this? How did they know? And more importantly, how could they be so sure? I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I typed back. Who is this? How do you know? 3 dots appeared immediately, and my heart pounded as I waited. Because I saw him leave. And I know where he went. My vision blurred for a second as panic surged through me. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to process. Someone was watching. Someone knew more than I did. I licked my lips, my pulse hammering as I typed my response. Where is he? The reply came almost instantly. Meet me if you want to know the truth. I stared at the message, my pulse thudding in my ears, my hands cold despite the warmth of the room. Every part of me screamed that this was a bad idea. I didn't even know who this was, how they got my number, why they were reaching out. But I knew one thing, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just sit here drowning in silence, waiting for answers that weren't going to come on their own. I had spent years feeling trapped, but now for the first time I felt completely untethered. And it terrified me. I forced my fingers to move, to type out a response. Where? The reply came instantly. Pier 17. 30 minutes. My stomach twisted. I knew that place. An abandoned dock on the outskirts of town, quiet, isolated. A place where people met when they didn't want to be seen. The kind of place Jacob would never go. Unless he had no choice. I grabbed my purse, my hands still shaking as I threw on jeans and a sweater. My body moved on autopilot, but my mind was a mess. racing through every possibility, every scenario. Was this a trap? Was it Nate? No, if it were him, he wouldn't have bothered with the mystery. He would have just told me outright. But if it wasn't him, who the hell was it? I checked my phone again, half expecting Jacob to have texted me, to have left some sign that this was all some elaborate mistake. But there was nothing. Just that last, final message. Don't call me again. I swallowed hard, grabbed my keys and walked out the door. The drive to Pier 17 felt like it took forever. Every red light stretching longer than it should. Every slow-moving car in front of me an unbearable obstacle. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I pulled onto the empty road leading to the docks, my heart hammering harder with every mile. The sky was overcast, gray and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When I reached the pier, there was only one other car in the lot. A black sedan. Tinted windows. No plates. My throat tightened as I pulled up a few spaces away, killing the engine but keeping my hands on the wheel, just in case I needed to make a fast exit. A figure stepped out of the sedan. A man. I couldn't see his face at first, but as he moved closer, recognition slammed into me like a freight train. Jake Sloan. I exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel harder. A private investigator. One I had hired years ago when I had first started suspecting Jacob was keeping things from me. But I had never gone through with it, never actually asked him to dig. I had let it go, convinced that whatever secrets Jacob had weren't worth uncovering. So why was he here now? I forced myself to get out of the car, ignoring the tremor in my hands as I approached him. What the hell is this? I demanded, keeping my voice steady even as my stomach twisted with unease. How do you know where Jacob went? Jake watched me carefully, his expression unreadable. Because I followed him. A chill ran through me. Why? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because someone else hired me first. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet. Who? He hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and held it out. You should read this before I say anything else. I stared at the paper like it might burn me. My fingers shook as I took it, unfolding it slowly, my eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Jacob's handwriting. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The letter was short, precise. A final message written before he vanished. I know everything. The words blurred as my vision swam, a sickening wave of realization crashing over me. My legs felt weak, my head spinning, my pulse roaring in my ears. Jacob hadn't just left. He had known that I gripped the letter so tightly my nails dug into the paper, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. My mind refused to process what I was seeing, what it meant. Jacob's handwriting. 3 words that changed everything. I know everything. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. Cold. Final. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. What does he know? Jake Sloan watched me, his face unreadable, his posture too still. You tell me. My hands clenched around the letter, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. This wasn't happening. Jacob couldn't have known. I had been careful. Hadn't I? The stolen moments, the late-night texts, the excuses. I had done what I needed to keep my life intact, to keep my secret buried. But Jacob had been watching, listening, and now he was gone. I forced my voice to stay steady, though my hands betrayed me, shaking where they held the paper. Who hired you? Jake exhaled slowly like he was bracing himself. Jacob. My stomach dropped. My mouth opened but no sound came out. That didn't make sense. Jacob would never do something like that. He wasn't the kind of man who played games, who dug into shadows. If something bothered him, he faced it head-on. He stayed. Until now. I shook my head, willing it to be a lie. That's not possible. Jake's gaze didn't waver. He came to me 6 months ago. The world tilted. 6 months. He had known for 6 months. And he had stayed. Slept beside me. Kissed me. Pretended. I felt sick. Jake's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. He didn't want revenge. Didn't want to confront you. Just wanted the truth. So I gave it to him. I looked at him, then really looked at him, and saw the pity in his eyes. My skin burned with it. Why are you telling me this? I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. Because Jacob didn't just leave Shauna, Jake said, his tone softer now. He disappeared. My blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? Jake hesitated. He cleaned out one of his accounts, ditched his phone, and boarded a bus out of town. No credit card charges. No hotel check-ins. No trail. He's not just gone. He made sure no one could follow. I shook my head wildly, refusing to believe it. No. He's coming back. He's just trying to punish me, make me worry. That's what this is. Jake didn't blink. If that's what you need to tell yourself. Anger flared in my chest, sudden and blinding. Then why the hell are you here? If you wanted to disappear so badly, why are you still involved? Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because he left something else. And I think you need to see it. Before I could ask, he turned and walked back to his car, opening the trunk. When he returned, he was holding a thick envelope. He extended it toward me, but I couldn't make myself move. What is it? I whispered. His jaw tightened. Proof. The word sent a tremor through me. Proof. Of what? That I had betrayed my husband? That I had thrown away the one person who had ever truly loved me? Or was it something worse? Something I wasn't prepared to face? Jake's voice dropped lower, more cautious now. Whatever you think you know, whatever you've convinced yourself of, it's time to stop lying. To yourself. To me. Because when you open this, there won't be any more pretending. My fingers curled into fists at my sides, my body rigid with tension. My breath came too fast, my mind screaming at me to walk away, to pretend I never got this message, never met him at this godforsaken pier. But I couldn't. I reached out, took the envelope with shaking hands, and knew in my gut, whatever was inside was about to destroy me. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of everything I had tried to ignore had been stuffed inside, waiting for this exact moment to crush me. My fingers hesitated at the seal, my breath shallow. I didn't want to open it. I wasn't ready. But Jake just stood there, arms crossed, eyes steady, waiting for me to stop pretending. I forced my hands to move, tearing it open, my stomach twisting as I pulled out the contents. Photos. Dozens of them. My fingers tightened around the edges as I flipped through them, each one hitting harder than the last. Me. With Nate. Our stolen moments weren't so stolen after all. There I was, pressed against him in a dimly lit parking lot. Another of me sliding into his car, my smile teasing, my hand resting on his thigh. More followed, hotel lobbies, whispered conversations at restaurants, Nate's hand on the small of my back as we walked too close, too familiar. The air left my lungs. He had known. He had known everything. The worst part? Jacob hadn't confronted me, hadn't raged, hadn't begged me to explain. He had just watched, collected proof, let me dig my own grave. And then he left. A cold sweat broke over me as I reached the last few photos. But these weren't of me and Nate. My pulse pounded as I saw Jacob instead. Sitting alone at a bar, staring into a drink, shoulders slumped like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Another of him standing at a bus station, one bag slung over his shoulder, looking at the schedule board. And then the last one, him getting on a bus. No return ticket. No hesitation. Just leaving. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the photos. Where did he go? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake sighed, watching me carefully. That's the thing. I don't know. I shook my head, my mind scrambling for something. Anything to hold on to. No, that's not possible. You just said you followed him. I followed him as far as I could, Jake admitted, his voice quieter now. He was careful. He ditched his phone, used cash. No paper trail. He got on that bus, and after that? He could be anywhere. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. Jacob had planned this. It wasn't just about leaving me. It was about erasing himself from my life completely. No phone. No credit cards. No breadcrumbs to follow. I had spent years wishing I could escape him, craving a life that wasn't tied to his quiet, steady presence. But now the idea of never seeing him again made my chest tighten in a way I didn't understand. Jake shifted slightly, studying me like he was trying to decide whether I deserved the truth. There's one more thing. I forced myself to look at him. What? He pulled out a folded note, smaller than the letter Jacob had left before. My name was written on the front in my husband's familiar handwriting. I snatched it from him, my fingers clumsy as I unfolded the paper. My vision blurred as I read the short, final message. You got what you wanted. Enjoy it. The ground tilted. The blood drained from my face. My knees felt weak. He wasn't just gone. He had meant to disappear. I had wished for freedom. I had dreamed of a life without him. And now Jacob had given me exactly that. And I had never felt so hollow. The words on the note blurred, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. You got what you wanted. Enjoy it. My hands trembled as I clutched the paper, as if I could squeeze out some hidden meaning, some clue that this wasn't what it seemed. But there was nothing. Just those cold, final words. I had spent years convincing myself that Jacob was the thing holding me back. That his steadiness, his quiet devotion, his predictability were a prison. But now that the bars were gone, now that I was standing in the open, I felt like I was falling. Jake Sloan watched me, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Say something. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. There has to be more. My voice cracked, embarrassingly weak. You don't just disappear overnight. You don't just... My fingers curled around the note until the paper crumpled. This isn't like him. Jake raised an eyebrow. Maybe you didn't know him as well as you thought. The words hit like a slap. I flinched, but I couldn't argue. The man I thought I knew would have stayed. The Jacob I married would have fought, would have tried to fix things even if there was nothing left to fix. But the Jacob in those photos? The one with slumped shoulders, drinking alone, boarding a bus to nowhere? I had broken that man. I forced myself to take a breath, trying to think through the fog in my brain. If he wanted to disappear, why even hire you? Why leave a note at all? Jake shrugged, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. Maybe he didn't start off planning to leave. Maybe he just wanted to understand what went wrong. Maybe he thought knowing the truth would help him decide. He paused. And maybe once he saw it all, he realized there was nothing left worth saving. The nausea hit me fast and hard. I pressed a hand against my stomach, swallowing down the bile. Nothing left worth saving. The worst part was that he was right. Jacob had waited. He had gathered his proof, let it all pile up in front of him, and then made his decision. He hadn't begged. He hadn't confronted me. He had just walked away. And I never even saw it coming. I turned back to Jake, desperate now. He had to have told someone where he was going. Jake hesitated. If he did, it wasn't me. I shook my head. What about his family? His job? His friends? I was grasping at straws, but I didn't care. He wouldn't just... My voice cracked again, and I hated the way it made me sound. Weak. Panicked. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His job thinks he took an extended leave. His family hasn't heard a word from him. As for his friends... He shook his head. Jacob never had many of those. The statement shouldn't have hurt, but it did. I knew it was true. Jacob had always been a quiet, solitary man, content with his routines, his simple life. He had never needed a big social circle, never cared for gossip or drama. He had been happy with me, with our life together. And I had ruined him. I gritted my teeth, trying to steady myself. There's always a trail, I muttered. No one just vanishes. Jake studied me for a long moment, like he was weighing something in his mind. Then he exhaled and reached into his pocket, pulling out another folded slip of paper. My pulse pounded as he handed it to me. This is the last lead I have. I yanked it open, my eyes scanning the scrawled address. It wasn't far. Just a few hours away, a small town I had never heard of. I looked up at him, my heart racing. You think he's there? Jake shrugged. I don't know. But it's the last place I traced him before the trail went cold. I swallowed hard. My hands clenched into fists. I had a choice. I could let him go. I could accept what he had done. Accept that this was what I had wanted all along. Or, I could go after him. I looked at the address again, my decision already made. Jacob thought he could just disappear. That he could walk away from me without a word, without giving me the chance to explain. He was wrong that I drove in silence. The hum of the engine, the only sound in the car as I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The crumpled piece of paper with the address Jake had given me sat in the passenger seat, taunting me with the possibility that Jacob might be there. That I might not have lost him completely. That maybe, just maybe, I could fix this. But could I? The truth was, I didn't know what I was going to say if I found him. I had spent years pushing him away, convincing myself I wanted something more, something different. And now that I finally had it, now that Jacob had vanished leaving me with the freedom I had craved, I felt hollow. The address led me to a small town 2 hours from home. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where life moved slower. It was the last place I would have imagined Jacob going. He had never been the type to run, never been the type to hide. But maybe that's why he had chosen it. The motel was easy to find. A rundown place with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. My stomach twisted as I pulled into the lot. This was it. This was where the trail had gone cold. I killed the engine and sat there for a long moment, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Part of me wanted to turn around, to forget I ever came. Because what if he didn't want to see me? What if he had already moved on, already decided that I was nothing more than a mistake he had finally corrected? I shoved the thought away and forced myself out of the car. The air was thick with the smell of rain. The sky darkening with the threat of a storm. I walked up to the front office, my heart pounding with each step. The clerk barely looked up when I entered. A man in his 50s with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He flipped through a newspaper, not even acknowledging me until I cleared my throat. "I'm looking for someone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tall, dark hair. Probably checked in a few days ago." The clerk finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You a cop?" "No." "Then why are you looking for him?" I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That I was his wife, the woman he had walked out on after discovering she had betrayed him? That I had spent years taking him for granted, only to realize too late that he was the only thing keeping my life from falling apart? I swallowed hard. "I just need to see him." The clerk studied me for a long moment, then sighed and reached for the register. "Had a guy check in a few nights ago. Paid cash. Didn't leave a name." Hope surged in my chest. "What room?" The clerk exhaled, tapping his fingers on the counter. "Look, lady, if he didn't tell you where he was, maybe he doesn't want to be found." I clenched my jaw. "Please, just tell me." He sighed again, like he had already decided he was going to regret this. End of the hall. Room 12. I turned on my heel and walked out before I could second-guess myself. The hallway was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and cheap air freshener. My pulse pounded as I stopped in front of room 12, staring at the worn brass numbers on the door. This was it. I raised my hand to knock, but my fingers hesitated inches from the wood. What if he didn't answer? What if he slammed the door in my face? Or worse, what if he opened it and I saw nothing in his eyes? No anger, no hurt. Nothing. I took a breath and knocked. Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. "Jacob." My voice was barely above a whisper. More silence. Panic clawed at my chest. What if I was too late? What if he had already left? I reached for the doorknob without thinking, expecting it to be locked. But it turned easily in my hand. The door swung open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering motel sign outside the window. My eyes adjusted slowly, scanning the small space. The bed was unmade, rumpled sheets and a single duffel bag tossed at the foot. And then I saw him. Jacob sat in the chair by the window, his posture tense, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't look at me, didn't move. But he wasn't surprised. He had known I would come. My breath hitched as I stepped inside, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Jacob," I said softly. Still, he didn't look at me. I swallowed hard, moving closer. I know you don't want to see me. I know I don't deserve." My voice cracked and I forced myself to keep going. "But I couldn't just let you disappear." A long silence stretched between us. Then finally Jacob spoke. "You should have." His voice was quiet, emotionless. I flinched. "I know I hurt you. I know I." "You don't know anything." He cut me off, finally turning his head to look at me. His eyes were unreadable, cold in a way I had never seen before. "You're only here because you hate losing control." I opened my mouth but no words came out. Jacob exhaled, shaking his head. "You spent years treating me like a placeholder. Like I was just there to fill the silence until something better came along." His lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "And now that I'm finally gone, You don't know what to do with yourself. Tears burned at the back of my eyes. That's not true. Isn't it? His words cut deeper than I thought possible. Because I had no defense. No excuses. Jacob leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Tell me something, Shauna. If I had confronted you, if I had asked you outright if you were cheating, would you have told me the truth? The room was too quiet. I swallowed hard, my hands clenching at my sides. Jacob, answer the question. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell him yes. I wanted to tell him that I would have broken down, that I would have told him everything and begged for forgiveness. But I couldn't, because that would have been a lie. And he knew it. Jacob nodded to himself, as if my silence was all the confirmation he needed. That's what I thought. The finality in his voice shattered something inside me. I had convinced myself that if I could just find him, if I could just explain, then maybe I could fix this. But Jacob wasn't waiting for an apology. He wasn't waiting for me at all. He had already let go. And I was the one left behind. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I didn't bother to wipe it away. Jacob exhaled, standing slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. You wanted freedom, Shauna. His voice was steady, almost gentle. Now you have it. And then, without another word, he walked past me, out the door and into the night. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Because for the first time in my life, I understood exactly what it felt like to be truly alone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door Jacob had just walked through. Maybe minutes. Maybe hours. The air in the motel room felt suffocating, thick with everything I had lost. Everything I had thrown away. I had spent so much time waiting for this moment, hadn't I? Waiting to be free. To have my own life, unburdened by the weight of Jacob's steady, predictable love. I had wanted something different. Something exciting. Something that made me feel alive. And now I had it. The realization settled in my stomach like a stone. I sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the rumpled sheets, at the half-packed duffel bag Jacob had left behind. The room smelled like him. Faintly like aftershave and coffee like home. My fingers clenched in the sheets before I forced myself to let go. It didn't matter. He was gone. For real this time. I wiped at my face, realizing too late that I was crying. The tears came without warning, silent and uncontrollable, streaking hot down my cheeks. I had no right to cry, I knew that. No right to feel anything but the emptiness I had created for myself. I forced myself to stand, to move, because sitting in this room in this silence was unbearable. I grabbed my phone from my purse, my hands shaking as I scrolled through my contacts, past Jacob's name. No longer reachable. Past the endless unanswered calls and messages I had sent over the past few days. And then without thinking I dialed Nate. It rang twice before he picked up. Shauna. His voice was laced with confusion, like he hadn't expected me to call. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he had already moved on to whatever woman would come next. I swallowed hard. Can you meet me? A pause. Where? I looked around the motel room, my stomach twisting in disgust. This wasn't my life. This wasn't where I was supposed to be. Not here. Just somewhere. Anywhere. Nate exhaled, but I could hear the curiosity in his voice. I'll be there in 20. I hung up without saying goodbye. By the time I got back to my car, the rain had started, slow and steady, drumming against the windshield. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My mascara had smudged, my hair was a mess, and my eyes were swollen from crying. I looked lost. As I was. I had spent years convincing myself that Jacob was the thing holding me back, the anchor keeping me from the life I was meant to have. But now that he was gone, I wasn't soaring. I was sinking. Nate pulled up beside me, his headlights cutting through the rain. He didn't say anything as he climbed into my passenger seat, just studied me with those sharp, knowing eyes. So, he said finally, I'm guessing this isn't a celebration. I let out a bitter laugh, wiping at my face. No. Nate nodded like he had expected that answer. So what happens now? It was a fair question. But I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, I had spent so long running from my life with Jacob that I had never once considered what would happen if I actually succeeded. And now, sitting here in this empty car, next to a man I had once thought could be my escape, I finally understood. Jacob had given me the freedom I had begged for. But he had been the only thing that ever made my life worth anything. And now I would never get him back. I turned to Nate, my voice hollow, empty. I don't know what happens now. And for the first time in my life, I had no one left to blame but myself. The end.